When you think of technology, you tend to assume that tech is everywhere, that every industry is using the same thing. Everyone's sending emails, using Zoom to communicate, using Slack to send funny memes. But you quickly learn that really that's not the case. Industries such as the medical and government industry can still be seen as using really relatively archaic systems. This is due to a variety of reasons, whether it be legal reasons to really have higher security or the fact that they're really massive systems. In fact, today, faxes are still used in a lot of these industries. And some of you might even know what a fax is. Today, we speak with someone, though, who's revolutionizing the medical industry, allowing companies to really get and use AI technologies, natural language processing, to really take a step forward and have more conversations with their customer. We speak with Lexi Kaplin, one of the co-founders of Conversation Health, and they're using the best-in-class conversation AI technology and medical expertise where they can help global life science companies deliver medical conversations at scale through text, voice, digital humans, across markets and across languages, really allowing for these companies to really scale at a rate using technology that is more common in other industries. Today's podcast, we talk a variety of things. How Lexi went from the world of making breath strips that have caffeine, and how she transitioned more in technology, and how by being in the world and really working with one of the most common drugs, being caffeine, she was able to learn a bit more about how certain industries can really utilize technology. Hopefully, you guys enjoy this episode, learn a bit more about how you can bring tech into different industries and scale at very rapid rates, and enjoy the podcast and learn a bit more about a story of another entrepreneur.
So I'm Lexi Kaplin. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer of Conversation Health. We focused on enabling conversational AI in the life science space. Ultimately, when I met my co-founder 5 years ago or so, he was a physician who practiced medicine for over 10 years and had a number of digital health companies that, truly when he ended up seeing conversational AI chatbots and the first time seeing that technology, got excited about what if I could have given this to my patients once they left the office? What if I could ensure they aren't ending up on Google or Yahoo Answers on, you know, unreliable resources to be able to get information about their health, but rather we're able to have a physician 24/7. And that's truly where the vision and mission of conversational health came from. How can we power 1 billion healthcare conversations a day? And we use AI to be able to scale that at large.
And when you were starting it, like did you have any experience within the medical field or within the physician field, or was this a newer space for you overall?
So I had incredibly limited experience, but thankfully just enough to be able to connect with my co-founder, John. My first company was an energy strip company, which
Mhm,
is actually how we met.
mhm,
But because it was a consumer packaged good that dealt with caffeine, which is regulated as a drug, of course, in Canada and the US, we had a little bit of experience with Health Canada and the FDA, and we're officially in the healthcare arm of startups. And my co-founder was actually running a digital health accelerator at the time out of
mhm,
Cossette. And when we ended up meeting with him to be able to bring Lumos through that
mhm.
accelerator, ended up creating a really great mentor relationship with him to the point where he first saw this technology of what is a chatbot, and asked me to be able to join him. And I just fell in love with the mission out of hearing the potential impact from being able to have that conversation at the right moment of time for a patient or health professional.
That's so it's always interesting hearing how the foundation stories happen because I mean it always reminds me of that photo where it's like the path is never a straight line. There's always twists and turns and caverns and everything else, but it really is the idea of like having conversations and networking and developing greater relationships really always tend to be helpful, but also like how a lot of these startups and businesses start.
Mhm.
You know, people from two different relative worlds or two different industries really coming together to combine a technology or develop products that were obvious looking back, but not obvious in the moment, combining especially tech within more of the healthcare systems. So
Yeah.
when you were starting this, like obviously the chatbot technology has been out for a while. I mean, it comes in like eaves and troughs. Like it was really cool and very interesting when it initially started. But then obviously with
Mhm.
AI, the ability for natural language processing, understanding tonation within the text became more and more popular. The idea initially start with trying to develop a technology to help a certain industry? Was it meant for a specific target? Were you trying to develop something and then adapt it to where it is there? Kind of how did that start? Because
Mhm.
I mean, there's like so many different options. There's so much use for really streamlining the process in many different parts of healthcare. How did it kind of start the idea? Was there a specific industry intended to focus on, or was it more developing the technology and then finding which markets or customers would tend to need this,
Mhm.
especially to work through workflow?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of both to start with, where my co-founder John
Mhm,
ended up finding out what is a chatbot for the
mhm,
first time. I think his daughter showed it to him and was like, "Look, I can talk to this thing on Facebook
mhm,
Messenger." And that's where he got really excited about the possibility of the impact of this technology in the industry with his experience as a
mhm,
health professional. When I actually joined him and we started this, it was focused on a direct to consumer application, a chatbot that could answer any questions around your health and wellness. How do you deal
mhm,
with stress during exam periods? What's the difference between type 1 and type 2
mhm,
diabetes? These kind of common questions that you would typically end up on Google to be able to find the answers for. And as we are looking to bring this out to hospital systems, pharma, medical associations to be able to essentially sponsor different modules of
mhm,
content that could be available within this chat experience, we ended up finding out that they were facing a lot of the same challenges we were in building this first chatbot. That
mhm,
because of the regulatory requirements and nuances of
mhm,
health language, that we use the same words in a healthcare context to mean completely different
mhm,
things than if we do in normal life. We ended up finding that there was this complete greenfield opportunity where they wanted to be able to create these chat experience for
mhm.
their patients, their health professionals. And that's where we ended up having a pivot as a company and focusing as a B2B conversational AI platform specifically geared towards that life science space. Just in
That
terms, as you were saying, of,
yeah.
in hindsight, looking back at these technologies, they almost seem obvious. I think the bit of eureka moment for me was actually thinking about the website
Mhm,
paradigm that ended up happening in the 90s, where I firmly believe, in one of our customers ended up quoting this back in our first year,
mhm,
every company needs a website, every company needs an app, every company needs a chatbot. This is essentially that next wave, I think, of technology within industries as a whole. And as we've seen in other industries,
mhm,
healthcare is always a little bit different and requires their own set of tools to be able to enable
mhm.
these capabilities.
I'll never forget having worked in that healthcare space for a
Hmm.
variety of different companies. It is very much a different field. I know people tend to not joke around with it, but always say like, "Oh, healthcare is a few years behind," just
Hmm.
because like compared to what a lot of the technologies are out there, you'd think it'd be easy to implement within healthcare. But obviously, what you touched on, there's regulations,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to people's personal health. Like giving a recommendation can be a very slippery slope, especially if it's medical advice versus not. This always reminds me of all the YouTubers who say, like, this is not financial advice. We're just going to give you a recommendation. But within healthcare, it's a little bit harder just to say, like, oh, hey, that's why AI diagnoses and all these things. It's like something that would always seem like, oh, hey, like this should make a lot of sense. Robots are very accurate or
Hmm.
AI is very accurate for predicting it. But it's very much more of I always say, like, a more of a complex conversation just because there's so many implications of like what is
Hmm.
said and how it terms are used. But I also like how you touched on how the words we use, especially within healthcare, can mean very drastically different things. Like one way, especially in like total conversation, there's sarcasm, there's a lot of like
Hmm.
interpretations. But when it comes to healthcare, you want to be very accurate and very and some of these things are very complex. So I like
Hmm.
how it was interesting how you touched on that, especially when building an AI where the words being used can make a big difference. when when you were trying to really develop this and kind of work as a bit as a business, was this always an interesting thing? Like, were you developing the product first and then getting customers, or were you working with customers to help develop it? Kind of what came for? I mean, it's always almost like a chicken and an egg problem, but kind of how were
Yeah.
you able to develop it to ensure that it was really fitting the market, but also kind of working with customers? Kind of how early was that brought into the part of the business? Were you working with customers right away and developing it alongside them, or
Mhm.
was it more you had this product and they were saying, "Hey, where is the best product market fit to kind of get this to really take off?"
Yeah, we definitely started focusing on customers to begin with to be able to validate the market. And
Mhm,
I think a lot of that ended up coming not only from my own experiences
mhm,
with, building a
mhm,
consumer package good where you can't do that. You need to have
mhm,
the physical product in place and it takes a lot of time for product development. But even seeing a lot of, my friends who are also entrepreneurs, particularly in the software space, where you can spend a lot of time and money building out a capability that doesn't fundamentally solve a core market need.
mhm,
And so As I was saying before, we had started, building out the capability a bit for our own direct to consumer applications. So we weren't starting from zero, but we
Hmm.
were able to recognize really early into our journey how um, the commercialization of it would actually need to pivot to be able to support these B2B models. And so from there, and I'd say really ingrained into our culture of a business, is being able to work with our customers to be able to understand what are the pain points they're facing. Why is it that they're not able to enable these
Hmm.
applications globally, for example? And so this is where I like to say every module, feature,
Hmm.
capability has been uniquely designed for the industry. And that's had a lot of collaboration and insights generated based off of our experience now with over 20 life science companies
Hmm.
globally.
And you touched on something interesting. You're saying how, like, the technology is quite unique and quite different, but like we were saying before, like there was knowledge of this that could be, obviously, I'm assuming companies were always aware that having a chat features can become
Mhm.
way more efficient, especially with more of the digitizing process. What were some of the big sticking points preventing businesses from, 6 years ago, really developing this and kind of running with it? Was it a technological issue, or was it the classic challenge where the products weren't developed for the industry? They were developed for the consumer industry. So there was
Mhm.
too much of a cavern to cross for it to really be impactful.
So within life sciences, having a simple open text bar
Hmm.
where a user can write anything they want has vast regulatory implications. Like you were saying
Interesting.
before,
Yeah.
with thinking about, you know, giving medical advice has implications
Hmm.
versus medical information versus, what to do if somebody, says a side
Hmm.
effect directly into the chat experience. And so what was really interesting back in 2017 when we first started is that you could see there was an interest in this industry. There was a lot of
Hmm.
really basic applications of the technology. They were, all decision tree based using closed text inputs just to validate that this is something that health professionals
Hmm.
and patients actually wanted and would engage with. But a lot of where we end up focusing is on enabling MLs that could specifically look for those kinds of regulatory
Hmm.
constraints of having an open text bar. That ended up being our first key insight that we developed to be able to operate in this industry. But as we then expanded to, different
Hmm.
applications across lines of business from medical to commercial to
Hmm.
clinical, there are different considerations about how you deal with certain types of content depending on, whether it's on label or off label, who can you say what to whom, what
Hmm.
can you tell a patient versus what can you tell a you know physician that actually has
Hmm.
training for this kind of medical information, what can be done in the US versus the UK versus Canada.
Hmm.
And so a lot of those kinds of, I'd say, environment and industry
Hmm.
requirements, because about a third of our team ended up coming directly from either, healthcare marketing or pharmaceuticals or regulatory associations like PAB here in Canada.
Hmm.
We were able to deeply understand all of the needs of the industry while
Hmm.
also having about a third of our team that were actual health professionals that, is the core reason why we were doing it, tools to
Hmm.
be able to support them or their patients. And that fueled really into, initially John's vision of
Hmm.
being able to have these chatbots available wherever his patients would need them. And then the last third are more, technology experts within the AI and ML
Hmm.
space, platform teams to be able to actually bridge those two requirements together and be able to create that technology. So it's kind of naturally evolved based off
Hmm.
of the key inputs we've had both internally, externally as a result of that.
And that's so true. I think one of the things I tend to see, especially within the space, is like having industry knowledge is so important, especially for a lot of these regulatory issues or things that may seem trivial at first, but are like mission critical.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Denver last weekend, going to ETH
Mm-hmm.
Denver, so like more in the Bitcoin blockchain DeFi space. And I was talking to a lot of founders there. I'm like, what's the one thing that stops a lot of founders from being successful? And the first thing they said is a lot of times people are building stuff that is just purely illegal. Like you can't do
Yeah.
this. And within the healthcare space, it's the same thing where people are like, oh, this is a great product. We can prescribe this, diagnose this. And then you talk to one lawyer or one doctor and they're like, you can't just tell someone like, and that's the whole, even something
No.
as simple as like a Google search. Like there was always like those implications like, hey, when you're googling something, should a website be able to tell you this or that? And I think it's, as you touched on,
Mm-hmm.
especially within this space, that like the laws and regulations, especially cross country, being a
Mm-hmm.
digital company, like it's very easy to go over
Mm-hmm.
borders, but everyone has different regulations and different ways of processing the information. And that's why I think it's so good having people from different worlds combine. So the tech people can say, hey, this is a physical limitation of technology. And then the people within the healthcare space can say, hey,
Mhm.
you literally can't do this. Or this is,
Exactly.
or you can do this, but like this is like wording so
In this
important. So
way.
yeah.
So what's so interesting about that, a lot of our early successes in, say, 2018
Mhm,
or so, is because, we ended up building it so uniquely to the requirements of this
mhm,
industry. It ended up being more compliant than humans, because if you had
mhm,
a sales rep or if you had a
mhm,
medical science liaison go out and talk to a physician, you don't know what they're going to say.
mhm.
Um, that's just the nature of being human,
Yeah.
obviously. But what was so interesting is that we ended up hitting this really critical inflection point where some of the regulatory teams, pharmacovigilance,
Mhm,
ended up being some of our greatest supporters within these companies, saying, "Oh wow, okay, you understand our industry, you
mhm,
understand our needs, you've been able to build to it. Let me use this as a tool to be able to enable more compliant
mhm.
conversations around this kind of information."
And that's so interesting. One thing that's always so interesting about it is how, like, especially when it comes to regulations, AI and robotics can sometimes be more or mostly more compliant because you know what they're going to say. There is a
Mhm.
methodology to it, and humans are irrational beings. All
Mhm.
the research says so. It is an interesting thing where a lot of people within I feel in the space always viewed AI as like uncompliant because I mean
Mhm.
maybe because Terminator or all these other things think that like
Yeah.
AI is going wild, but in most cases, if not all cases, there is better logic. There is a much more of a decision tree or a process in place to meet the compliance regulations of a specific industry.
Mhm.
So jumping back a bit, we met with your when you were developing your energy strips, the caffeine strips. I had no idea. It makes sense that caffeine is a food a drug, categorized as a
Yeah.
drug. Never would have considered that just because I maybe because like energy drinks are so popular and you think they're a little bit
Mhm.
wild that they can sell them and market them the way they do. But one of the exciting things with it was obviously it was a CPG good, and
Mhm.
I've talked to many products, getting products on shelf, and that's like a whole different world. I come more
Yeah.
from more tech side of things, so it's so different. What were some of the biggest differences between like the CPG world and like going into more of a tech based industry or medical industry? Was there a I guess because there's so many different differences, was there one thing where you thought that it would transfer over a lot easier and that when you're starting your business, you're like, oh, this doesn't translate at all. This is like I have to relearn how this is done. Were there any big
Mhm.
misconceptions you had going into it thinking it might be a similar world? In fact, it may have not been at all.
It's a really good question. I can't say I've ever thought about where the similarities lie,
Mhm,
because I definitely did have a bit of a pivot after some of the
mhm,
frustrations I had in the CPG
mhm,
world, where one of actually Next Canada ended up being a
mhm,
huge influence on me with that particular
mhm,
decision, because as we were bringing the caffeine strips through the Next 36, ended
mhm,
up having one of our last sessions of the summer that was all focused around key learnings.
mhm,
What are the opportunities to be able to expand your current venture, but also
mhm,
what are the learnings for your next one? And what I ended up doing after that session was going down and writing all of the frustrations I had
mhm,
within the CPG space of how long it takes to develop,
mhm,
how you also essentially go from tabletop to manufacturing
mhm,
and needing to deal with all of the time cycles and that you lose a lot of control, that
mhm,
you aren't able to be as cash efficient because it
mhm,
takes a lot of capital up front, that you don't necessarily have that direct connection to your customers, so that you're not able to essentially iterate as efficiently,
mhm,
because you might be talking with one customer but not the buying
mhm.
power of 1,000 of them, so to speak.
Yes.
And so that's where I ended up purposefully pivoting into the software space, at least for now,
Yeah.
because of a lot of those learnings that I had in the CPG space that I thought would be um, a better opportunity cost to be able to
Mhm,
focus in software instead. That said, there are very few things as meaningful as being able to hold something that you have physically
mhm,
created. And so that's something that I miss. We can't hold our
mhm,
chatbots.
mhm,
But that said, I think that, I have a huge amount of respect for people who
mhm,
work in the CPG industry, just because of that experience that I had with Lumos and what we ended up
mhm.
creating from there.
What you touched on is so true. I'll talk to a lot of people, and especially within the CPG world, how you touched on not being able to see your customer. Uh, same. One second. Let me get him.
No
One
problem.
second. Kona, you have to calm down. You're too angry. You're too angry. You're not allowed at the window. Sit. Okay, you can go back. Come. You sit. Okay, bye. He'll calm down now. Oh yeah. So I was saying is within the CPG world, I talked to a few different people, and one thing they touched on, what you touched on, is that you can't connect your end consumer. You're going through disties, distributors. For a lot of the ones people I spoke to, like you're getting on grocery store shelves, and the way they speak to your product is never going to be the same as you as a founder.
Yeah.
Is never going to be able to like the packaging they may put out behind something. There's all these little issues that affect the brand and the way you connect with your customer. And one unique thing about software, I feel, is that like you can speak to your customers almost directly, and typically quite often where on in the consumer world there's quite a disconnect between, like you said, all the distributions until you get to the end user, and you'll hear a few things, but typically you're hearing from either the extreme people who love your product or extremely angry for sometimes the most trivial things. They'll be like, I went to the store and the packaging was like ruined, and you're like, well, I can't control that, it was my distributor. Like, how am I supposed to have all the answers? But you have to trust that it kind of goes through the right processes, and you have to. It is, but at the end of the day, like you said, it is nice having a thing you can hold, put on your wall, and kind of say, "This is what I've created."
Absolutely, but I do think though that software and particularly chat and conversational AI present such an opportunity for data-driven decision making because you're able to see unfiltered what somebody's reaction was. You don't need to necessarily ask for their feedback, but rather, look at particular chat interactions. What was answered properly? What wasn't? What's getting good feedback? What's not getting good feedback? What's causing frustration? What's the sentiment? And so definitely appreciate that kind of full end-to-end visibility, like you said, where in software you tend to have near real-time feedback whenever you need it. Whereas in the CPG world, there's a little bit more of a delay or bias in any kind of feedback that you're getting.
So, especially within the tech world, you say you kind of get that feedback instantly. There's a lot of data being created. How? I mean, this is a question I always like to ask, but it's kind of interesting. How do you differentiate between feedback and people? I guess the other question is, how do you differentiate between feedback and like overanalyzing data? I think one of the challenges, especially within the tech world, is that you have all these data points, and you always love to like run regression, run all these numbers, trying to figure out something. And most of the time, the answers are exactly what you thought, or an assumption you thought, or you're calculating it wrong. How are you able to really take the data and really differentiate between the noise and like what actual feedback is? Because I know sometimes you may just have negative users who are always going to be negative. How are you able to really understand the release sentiment towards the product, or kind of learnings versus maybe just some of the noise that may come with having thousands of people on the platform? There's always going to be extremes, and a lot of times, especially in the social media world, they always say like the people who are angry are always the loudest, and they're always a vocal minority of the typical user. How are you able to kind of navigate that world, especially that there is obviously a lot more compliance, a lot more little conversations you're able to track and kind of learn a bit more about?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because normally I don't know if our insight would be any different than most software companies of looking for trends and being able to often end up on the solutions that are a lot more simple than, where maybe your engineering team wants to be able to focus a little bit more time on the fun technical challenges versus we need to show this UI slightly differently.
Yeah.
That said, in the last couple of years, we've done a lot of work in the COVID space, both with therapeutics and vaccines. And it's been so interesting because obviously within COVID, it's such a polarizing topic that for any kind of consumer facing application, there's going to be reactions to the chat experience and reactions just to the political environment that we all are living in. And so that's been really interesting to try to assess what's the core feedback that's related to our application versus what's the feedback that's just more generally the ecosystem that we're all living in right now. And it ends up being a lot of, like you said, analyses, looking at the trends, all of that. But at one point, you need to be able to take a step back and look holistically at the kind of feedback that you're getting and try to understand what are those holistic trends and what's potentially the root cause for each of them.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, like I said, working a little bit in the medical space now, especially with the changes of COVID, it's just caused a lot of change for everyone. There's obviously a lot more stress, a lot more pressure on people, especially with work from home. We have different demographics who have been hit harder, and there's a lot. It's like you said, it's a very difficult climate to navigate and understanding what is the political atmosphere, especially now within
Mhm.
Canada, versus real feedback, and kind of being able to differentiate between someone who maybe just, especially within the mental health space, people just need to vent and
Yeah.
kind of get something off their chest versus actually having issues with the
Mhm.
platform or with kind of the software that's being utilized. Um, Obviously, COVID still quite a big thing, and you ran your business prior to COVID and during COVID. What were some of the big changes between pre-COVID days and with COVID? Obviously, working from home became more of a thing.
Mhm.
Was that a hard transition to navigate, or was it something that was able to adapt to relatively quickly, being more of a tech-focused business
Mhm.
to start with?
So, funny enough, we had ended up doing a trial work from home day the Friday before everything shut down,
Mhm,
where we asked everybody to bring their laptops home. We were going to use it as
mhm,
a dry run to be able to understand does the system start to break?
mhm,
What do we need to be prepared for in the case that we do need to work from home? And we weren't able to come back on Monday as planned.
mhm,
So I think that we ended up adapting to it just out of the nature of needing to at that time, especially because the problems that we're solving with conversational AI got
mhm,
exaggerated through COVID as there were more questions than ever around health and there were
mhm,
less people to be able to answer it. And so I think that really for the first 6 months of lockdown or so, our team was honestly grinding harder than I think we ever have before, just because there was such a high demand, such a high need.
mhm,
And people who work at CH genuinely care about the industry. Like I said, we have a lot
mhm,
of health professionals. I'd say everybody else has some kind of affiliation, whether in their
mhm,
family or personal life, to health as an industry. And so there's a lot of passion on the team
mhm,
to be able to drive these kinds of solutions and enable those supports. We are getting things even as tactical as I'm locked out of my office
mhm,
as a physician and I can't get access to these resources. So, um, definitely, I think we had to adapt quickly out of the nature of it. There then became that, issue
mhm,
that I think everybody and every company ended up having of how do we balance
mhm,
work and business. And after a couple months, we ended up realizing we weren't coming back anytime soon. But now I think we've ended up striking a really good balance where we have an office space, we have the
mhm,
ability to meet for value add team
mhm,
sessions, bonding, etc., and really use it for those kinds of opportunities that need you to be in person. But
mhm,
when it comes to your regular 9 to 5, we actually are all very productive and often prefer working from home. We end up running a number of polls and surveys within the
mhm,
team as well. And I think this kind of hybrid nature is what everybody's craving right now, where if you want to go into the office, you can. If you don't, you don't have to unless there's, a
mhm.
particular event that's needing it.
I like how you touched on it, especially with the idea that I think for a lot of people, having the hybrid model is always, I think, always the best case. But like you said, surveying the employees and asking them, because I feel like one of the things was initially my assumption was everyone prefers working from home. Like, hey, it's
Mhm.
great. You just stay at home, you just work, you don't have to commute. It's great. But then talked to my other coworkers, and they're like, I hate it. I
Yeah.
have kids who are at home all the time. I have to teach them school. I like have, and then what happens, as you said, is like the separation between work and life becomes very difficult,
Mhm.
especially as an entrepreneur, which is already a challenging thing. But being able to, at least with a commute, you're like, okay, I'm leaving the office. I can leave some
Yeah.
ideas behind. But one of the big challenges, especially if you're living in an apartment, you're working on your kitchen table, that just, you start attributing that table as work. So when you eat dinner, you're in a working mind.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was like not silly, but you always think like, okay, how like physical location shouldn't matter that much, but it's a huge difference. Like, hey, this is my work room, this is my fun room,
Mhm.
this is like the lounge, this is TV area. But like having that physical separation, even if it's like moving a chair to a chair, is so
Mhm.
important, especially with separating the idea of like work mode and relaxing mode. And that's, I think, obviously what contributes to a lot of burnout, not being able to
Yeah.
ever switch it off. So I think a lot of organizations, a lot of people have slowly been able to figure that out and now are able to, I feel, work from home. I think everyone was able to work from home effectively, but over a long term, now they're able to really balance, like get that work life balance back to a
Mhm.
more healthy state. So you've had a few businesses. You work kind of within the entrepreneurship world, a few different ways. CPG, now tech. Is there anything that it was easier than you thought? Like kind of looking back, saying like you thought this would be a bigger challenge, and it wasn't actually big of a challenge as maybe expected. And the other side thing, was there something you thought would be pretty simple to do, but was a much more challenging, much more time consuming process uh, than you may have expected coming in fresh or green into the startup and entrepreneurship space?
Uh, I think that I probably underestimated scaling, as most
Mm,
people do when they haven't done it yet.
mhm.
And we've been really fortunate to be essentially doubling the team every year since we first got started. So we're
Wow.
now over 100 people. I need to check
Mhm,
what our latest number is,
mhm,
probably 200 by the end of the year. And there ends up being some really interesting inflection points when you go from, say, 10, 15 people and you
mhm,
can talk to everybody every day to being 50 people and needing to have a little bit more of a structure in place. And
mhm,
that's when we ended up introducing a really amazing leadership layer beyond myself and the
mhm,
co-founders. And at 100, there ends up being that additional inflection point too, where we're now having a proper structure, team growth opportunities, and
mhm,
more to be able to really ensure that we're able to have the mechanisms in place that are needed to support essentially full world
mhm,
coverage from a time zone perspective, while also delivering all of um, the capabilities and opportunities that we're working
mhm.
on. In terms of what was easier than I thought, I'm not sure if anything's particularly easy when starting a
Yeah.
company, but I think if you have a good team, if you have
Mhm,
great people, it makes it a lot more enjoyable when you're trying to
mhm,
work through the challenges. So I think if anything, we got very lucky stumbling upon this
mhm,
complete gap in the market and end
mhm,
up being right time, right place, right technology to be able to enable it. And I don't know if that's necessarily easy versus luck,
mhm,
but we ended up really identifying that product market fit early on. And that's been a tremendous fuel for growth
mhm.
for our entire business.
And the product market fit thing, everyone always talks about it, but it's so important. I think it's one of those things where
Mhm.
it's like, it's the same thing of like people always like eat your vegetables or like, hey, going for a walk's good for your like health and like working out's healthy for you. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, that's an easy answer, but like it's difficult to do. Like being active every day, it's a difficult thing. I think that the product market fit sounds simple. Everyone's like, yeah, I do it. But talking to customers, understanding it,
Mhm.
really, like you said, really being humbled, being like, is this how you think? And people being like, no, this is not what we want. And I'll be like, okay, you step back,
Mhm.
rethink of how I'm approaching this industry because obviously with entrepreneurship, you require a lot of confidence, but you also have to be able to be humbled and be like, okay, am I really solving the right challenge? And what you touched on, one of the things that can be difficult is that scale. I think it sounds similar. Like, great, 5 to 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 1,000. All these stepping points, like you said, are require different things, require different structures, require different management styles, and require those maybe even middle
Mhm.
management within it. And having talked to a few different entrepreneurs here and there, that seems to be a very common. I'd say it's obviously a challenge, but like something that's surprising. It's always, and I feel like it
Mhm.
always is surprising, being like, oh goodness, like 10 employees, you know everyone. Now I have new people walking in, being like, do you work here? And then they're like, yeah, yeah. I'm
Mhm.
like, oh my goodness, this is so much different than the whole like startup-y mentality of like, oh, we're fast, we're dynamic, we're breaking things. And then
Yeah.
you're like, we have 100 people. We can't just be breaking things every day. We have to have a little more
Yeah.
rigor now that there's real customers and real things on the line. But yeah, no. So I guess a lot of growth has happened. Like, kind of, what does the next 5 years look like? I know you say you touched on like different times, and like, is it the
Mhm.
goal to focus more within country territories, or is it really to expand globally and kind of offer these services everywhere? Kind of, what does the next 2 to 5 years look like for you in the business?
Yeah, well, ultimately, our mission is to power a billion health related conversations a day. And the way that we're going to get there is by being the conversational AI platform standard for the life
Mhm,
science industry. There's a great precedent that's now been set with, the CMS for life sciences, the CRM for life sciences, all of
mhm,
these massive technologies that have vertical wide or sorry horizontal wide
mhm,
applications and markets never really have the opportunity to penetrate healthcare because of those unique considerations for the
mhm,
industry. There's a company called Viva that is massive in the healthcare
mhm,
space, and within 10 years they ended up being $1 billion company. That's something that we see. They're a CMS platform where they've now added on different product lines,
mhm,
but we see that conversations are just as big as content within healthcare in particular
mhm.
because of its ability to impact um, people at that moment of need. And so we really want to be that platform standard across the entire industry globally
Mhm.
at enabling conversational AI agents.
And that's so exciting. I feel like there's so many options, there's so much growth potential, and that's like such a exciting goal. I think like you were saying,
Hmm.
there's so much efficiencies that can be created with this, and especially as we see now with like stresses more on the healthcare system and like really people being, I'd really say COVID got a lot more people aware of their physical and mental health.
Hmm.
Like there is a little bit more of a conversation, and there's more knowledge. I think even after COVID may never go away, but like, after COVID really I hate to say, like back to new normal, I do think people will still continue caring more about their health or being, realizing to some extent their mortality and that, hey, I have to really take care of myself. Uh, After the past 2 years, realizing, okay, maybe I have to be a little more active. Maybe, staying at home all
Hmm.
day in front of a screen isn't the best thing for me, kind of taking, real controlling all that. So, yeah, no, I think it's very unique and very excited to see kind of what the growth looks like for you guys in the next few years, especially with how fast it's been over the last little while, going from a small team to really being a medium sized business like you guys
Hmm.
are today. Uh, it was great having you on the podcast, and yeah, hopefully you can hit your billion conversations a day and really allow for the process to be much more streamlined.